I don't know what kind of monster you're raising, Liam, but it's a menace. I was just standing there, on my perpetually too green lawn, the one I paid someone else to cut because, frankly, grass is a commitment I can't handle. And I was holding a leash. At the other end of that leash was Tank, a large caramel-colored mutt who looked like the result of a golden retriever deciding to date a very handsome bison. Tank, at that exact moment, was sniffing a dandelion with the intense concentration of a Nobel laureate contemplating quantum physics. He was a velvet-pawed bear who thought aggression was a flavor of chew toy. The source of the sonic boom of indignation? Mrs. Henderson, or as the neighborhood group chat called her, Karen. "He's sniffing a weed, Mrs. Henderson," I replied, trying to keep the sarcasm at a low simmer, which is always a struggle for me before 10 a.m. "I think the greatest liability he presents is probably hay fever." Karen, whose aggressively ironed denim shorts practically squeaked with rigid propriety, stepped closer to the edge of my lawn. "Don't you dare try to trivialize this. Look at him. He is large, he is dark, and he projects an aura of hostility that is frankly unacceptable in this community." I looked down at Tank. His ears were cocked, his tail was doing that slow, confused wag, and he seemed to be silently asking, "Is the fuzzy yellow thing edible?" If that was an aura of hostility, then so was a basket of confused puppies. "Mrs. Henderson, he is a dog. He's happy. If you think his aura is hostile, maybe that says more about your aura than his," I countered, leaning into the leash. "It's his face. It looks mean. He is intimidating the children and the property values. My granddaughter refuses to play near your fence because of that beast," she shrieked, pointing a rigid finger at Tank's noble, slightly droopy muzzle. I bit back a retort about her granddaughter's highly questionable taste in lawn games and sighed internally. This wasn't about safety. This was about Karen's unshakable need to control the visual integrity of her environment. And apparently my magnificent mutt wasn't passing her vibe check. She had been nitpicking Tank's existence since the day I moved in, escalating from passive-aggressive stares to active confrontation. "He is a liability, Liam, a genuine liability. And if you refuse to control his appearance, I will be forced to file an official complaint with the Homeowners Association and the non-emergency police line," she declared, crossing her arms with the triumphant certainty of a woman who was absolutely sure she had just invented the wheel. I pinched the bridge of my nose, fighting the urge to respond with a sound that was half yawn, half scream. The HOA? The police? Because my dog looked mean? This was peak suburban melodrama, and I was utterly exhausted by it. I looked at Tank again, who had finally decided the dandelion was not, in fact, edible, and was now looking up at me with large, golden eyes, waiting for his next command. "Mrs. Henderson," I said, keeping my voice flat and terrifyingly calm. "I understand your concern is purely aesthetic. It's about his threatening appearance, correct? Not his actual behavior." She puffed out her chest. "Precisely. Optics matter, Liam. Optics." "Right. Optics," I repeated slowly, letting the word roll around my mouth like a piece of gravel. That was it. That was the magic word. The fuse in my brain, which had been smoldering with irritation for months, finally snapped. I stared at the absurd woman in front of me, then down at my noble, clueless dog, and a truly magnificent, petty idea began to form. If the problem was his appearance, then I would change his appearance so radically, so formally, that any complaint would sound like a scene from an avant-garde play. "Thank you for clarifying your complaint, Mrs. Henderson," I said, giving her a small, almost theatrical bow. I assure you, I will mitigate the visual threat immediately. You'll find that when we next take the lawn, Tank will be dressed for the occasion." She paused, confusion warring with smugness. "Dressed for... what are you talking about?" I didn't answer. I just turned on my heel, hauled Tank off the dandelion, and marched back toward my house. As I wrestled the key into the door, I pulled out my phone and accessed the one place I knew could deliver on my new, glorious mission: the internet, specifically the high-end canine formal wear section. I slammed the door shut, eloquating a small bark of surprise from Tank. He looked at me, tilting his head. "Fine, Karen," I muttered under my breath, pulling up the credit card details. "You want formal? You're getting black tie. And I hope it bankrupts me because this level of spite is priceless." The next morning, I woke up with the kind of energy only pure, undiluted spite can generate. This wasn't just about winning an argument. This was about establishing a new, absurd normal. This was about sartorial warfare. The mission was clear: acquire the most ridiculous, perfectly tailored dog tuxedo humanly possible. I dragged Tank out of his dog bed, a massive plush pillow he treated like a beanbag chair, and informed him he was about to become a gentleman. He responded by trying to lick the residual coffee from my mug. Our first stop was a place called the Dapper Dog's Den. Seriously, I drove 10 miles just to visit a place with a name that ridiculous. The store itself was a sterile, white mausoleum of overpriced pet accessories. The air smelled vaguely of organic lavender and generational wealth. I was greeted by a young woman with a perfectly sculpted eyebrow and a clipboard. Her name tag read Chantel, Canine Stylist. "Welcome," Chantel said, barely moving her mouth. "Is your client in need of a bespoke look, or perhaps an elevated casual ensemble?" I suppressed a laugh that would have shattered the pristine silence. "Bespoke, Chantel. Maximum bespoke. We're thinking black tie, double vent jacket, satin lapel. We need to convey a look of solemn yet approachable authority. He's going for maitre d', who might judge your wine choices." Chantel actually nodded, as if this was a completely normal request. "Ah, the uncertain sommelier. An excellent choice for a large breed like Tank. Does Mr. Tank prefer a single-breasted or double-breasted cut?" I spent 45 minutes talking about lapels, pleats, and the structural integrity of the mini bow tie. It cost me half a paycheck, but the sight of Tank standing on a velvet cushion while Chantel carefully pinned a tiny, perfect black jacket around his girth was truly breathtaking. It was absurd. It was magnificent. It was perfect. Tank, meanwhile, was completely stoic, looking deeply serious, as if he understood the gravity of his new role as a fashion icon. He barely batted an eye. Perhaps he knew, deep down, that this was his destiny. The result was jarringly ridiculous. The black tuxedo, the crisp white shirt, the miniature bow tie, it transformed him from a lovable oaf into a four-legged agent of international diplomacy. He looked like he was about to ask me if I had a reservation for dinner. "You're ready for war, buddy," I whispered, zipping him into the car. He tried to lick my ear, but the tuxedo was only half the plan. To truly defeat Karen, I couldn't just dress Tank up. I had to escalate the absurdity of my entire life. I needed a monument to spite. "Tank," I announced, driving home. "Our backyard is trash. It simply does not match the sheer social standing of your new threads. We need a project. We need a canine observation deck and fortress." This, of course, was just going to be a ridiculously over-engineered doghouse built on a slightly elevated wooden deck. But the name was everything. I pulled out my phone and searched for contractors. I needed someone tough, someone who wouldn't immediately call Adult Protective Services on me. I found Big Tony's Total Home Transformations. Tony's website featured a blurry photo of a man who looked like he fought concrete mixers for fun, and the tagline, "We build stuff, don't ask questions." Perfect. I called the number. A voice like a cement mixer gargling gravel answered. "Yeah, Tony." "Hi, Tony, this is Liam. I'm calling about a complex project. It's highly bespoke, involving some unique architectural demands and very specific client requirements." I paused for dramatic effect. The client has exceptionally high standards regarding comfort, security, and sightlines. There was a long, static-filled pause. "What you building? A spa?" "A canine observation deck and fortress," I clarified. "I need a site visit ASAP. The client is available this afternoon." Tony didn't hang up. A good sign. "Fine. 3 o'clock. Don't waste my time, kid." I hung up, feeling energized. Operation Dapper Dog was complete. Operation Fortress of Formal Spite was underway. I glanced at Tank, who was looking out the window, his tiny bow tie slightly askew, completely unaware of the chaos his elegance was about to unleash. He really did look like a confused, well-dressed maitre d'. The absurdity was already peaking, and we hadn't even introduced Tank to the gruff professional world yet. This was going to be better than I hoped. I just needed to make sure I had enough dry cleaning budget for the world's most formal canine consultant. This tux had to be pristine. For victory. For spite. For Tank's honor. Big Tony arrived promptly at 3:00 p.m. in a monstrous, mud-splattered pickup truck that looked like it had survived the apocalypse and was coming back for seconds. He was accompanied by 2 guys who were essentially human-sized slabs of reinforced concrete. Tony himself wore a permanently skeptical expression and a t-shirt that looked like it hadn't been dry since 2005. I opened the door, dressed in a clean but standard polo shirt. The contrast between my casual wear and the sheer elegance standing next to me was, I thought, quite artistic. "Tony, great to meet you," I said, extending my hand. Tony gave me a brief, crushing handshake, his eyes scanning the yard, looking for the complex project or maybe a giant hole in the ground. Then his eyes landed on Tank. Tank was sitting perfectly still, center stage on my lawn, wearing his brand-new black tuxedo. He wasn't moving. He was just existing with an air of profound dignity, occasionally letting out a tiny, contemplative sigh. He looked less like a dog and more like a very serious investor who was waiting for the market to bottom out. Tony stopped dead. The 2 concrete slabs behind him stopped dead. Silence descended, broken only by the faint, distant sound of Karen power washing her immaculate walkway. "The client," Tony finally grunted, pointing a massive thumb at Tank. "Yes, Mr. Tank, senior project consultant. He insisted on being present for the initial site survey," I explained, adjusting Tank's bow tie. Tank offered Tony a polite, silent stare. Tony just blinked. Once. Slowly. "I'm here to talk about a deck, pal, not a circus act." "This is serious, Tony. Mr. Tank has very specific requirements for the canine observation deck and fortress. I am merely his interpreter and signatory. You'll need to address your structural questions to him, and I will relay the feedback." Tony looked at me, then at Tank. Tank let out a soft woof, a noise I interpreted as a grave caution. He says he's concerned about the load-bearing capacity of standard 4x4s under extended periods of squirrel surveillance. I translated immediately. He's suggesting treated lumber, perhaps 6x6s for the main support columns. Excellent point, buddy. Tony's face was a masterpiece of internal conflict. His professional ethics were battling the sheer, overwhelming, ridiculous reality of the situation. He finally pulled out a grubby notepad. Fine. 6x6s, pressure treated. You gonna pay for that? The client demands quality, Tony. Cost is secondary to performance and durability, I said, patting Tank's perfectly tailored shoulder. We spent the next 30 minutes debating the nuances of the fortress. I explained the ball retrieval ramp, which was just a low-angle ramp so Tank didn't hurt his knees, and the squirrel surveillance turret, which was an elevated platform with a small, weatherproof overhang. Tank, sitting politely in his suit, would occasionally shift his weight. He says the egress point needs to be wider than initially planned, primarily to accommodate his morning zoomies, I informed Tony, after Tank stood up and scratched his ear. The dog wants a wider door, Tony translated flatly to his crew, who were now openly staring at Tank. One of the crew members, a skinny guy named Manny, actually pulled out his phone and started filming. No, Tony, the senior project consultant requires a wider egress point suitable for rapid deployment during an unauthorized rodent incursion, I corrected, trying not to laugh at the look of despair on Tony's face. The conversation continued like this, with Tony attempting to maintain his professional facade, while I insisted on treating Tank's every movement as a detailed architectural critique. It was pure, dialogue-driven absurdity, and it was glorious. Finally, we got to the contract. Tony slid a dog-eared document across my picnic table. Okay, kid, it's $4 grand. Half now. Sign here. Don't tell anyone about this conversation. Not until the senior project consultant has approved the terms, I insisted. I laid the contract flat on the table and produced a small, non-toxic ink pad I'd strategically purchased the day before. Tank, the joists need to be treated, but the payment terms are fair. Sign here, buddy. Tank, with surprising ease, it helps that he thinks all my ridiculous games lead to treats, lifted a paw and firmly pressed his enormous, muddy print right next to the line for the client signature. The muddy paw print stood out starkly against my neat ballpoint signature. Tony looked at the contract. He looked at the paw print. He looked at Tank's tuxedo. He took the check. I'm gonna need to see a therapist after this, he muttered, stuffing the cash in his pocket. He then turned to his crew. Let's go, now, before the dog asks us for quarterly projections. As Tony and his crew scrambled into their truck, speeding away like they'd just witnessed an alien abduction, I glanced down the street. Sure enough, Karen was driving by in her silver sedan. Slowly. Her eyes were bugged out. She saw a large construction truck speeding away, a man in a polo shirt laughing, and a massive dog sitting proudly on a picnic table in a double-vent satin lapel tuxedo with a fresh paw print of ink on his chest. She didn't know what it was. She didn't know why it was. But she knew she couldn't complain that the dog looked menacing. He looked like he was about to give a very serious TED Talk on fiduciary responsibility. She hit the gas and disappeared, utterly baffled. Success, Mr. Tank. Maximum baffling achieved, I announced. Tank just yawned, revealing a giant, pink, surprisingly polite tongue. The deck construction was well underway, which meant Big Tony's team were now a semi-permanent fixture in the neighborhood, causing Karen endless anxiety. But the construction noise wasn't what brought us to the community council meeting 2 weeks later. It was the formal, menacing dog complaint she had filed right after our initial lawn standoff. The Community Council of Maplewood Estates hereby calls to order the hearing regarding complaint 2024-44 filed by Mrs. Janice Henderson against Mr. Liam Carter regarding the presentation and perceived menace of his canine, droned Mr. Peterson, the chairman, a retired accountant who looked perpetually uncomfortable in his own skin. Tank and I were seated at a small table in the community room. I had dressed in my Sunday best, a slightly rumpled blazer, but Tank was the star. He wore the black tux, freshly dry-cleaned, with a new, crisper bow tie. He looked less like an animal and more like a very tiny, very hairy hedge fund manager. The small panel of 3 bewildered-looking neighbors tried to look official. Karen was already at the witness stand, gripping the edge of the table like it was the life raft on a sinking ship. "Mrs. Henderson, your testimony," Mr. Peterson sighed, glancing nervously at Tank. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," Karen began, her voice quivering with false drama. "For months, this animal has terrorized me and my neighbors. Its size, its coloring, its gait, it is all designed to intimidate. It is a genuine threat to the suburban tranquility we cherish. I ask you, Counsel, to look at this creature, this brute, and tell me it doesn't project a hostile image." She wheeled around and dramatically pointed at Tank. The effect she was hoping for, a gasp of collective fear, was utterly nullified. Tank, at that moment, was gently grooming his left paw, looking slightly bored. His bow tie was straight. He was a portrait of bored, four-legged respectability. "I submit, Counsel, that the visual threat has only been amplified by the respondent's construction project, a massive, aggressive fortress built solely to allow the menace higher ground for intimidation," Karen finished, her voice hitting a hysterical pitch. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson," Mr. Peterson muttered, rubbing his temples. "Mr. Carter, your defense." I stood up slowly, adjusting my blazer. I took a deep, formal breath. "Mr. Chairman, members of the Council, I appreciate Mrs. Henderson's dedication to aesthetics," I began, channeling the spirit of every over-the-top courtroom drama I'd ever seen. "We are here today to address the complaint that my client, Mr. Tank, presents a threatening appearance based on his natural physique. Mrs. Henderson stated that optics matter." "I agree." I paused, walking around the table to stand beside Tank. I placed a protective yet proud hand on his back. "I submit to the Council that Mr. Tank is wearing a custom-tailored double-vent tuxedo purchased at significant expense from the Dapper Dog's Den, a certified sartorial establishment. This is not a costume. It is a statement of intent. Does this look like the uniform of a menace or the uniform of a dog who might ask you, 'May I check your coat?' and then politely request a small piece of cheddar cheese?" A giggle erupted from the back of the room. Mr. Peterson banged his gavel lightly. "Furthermore, I would like to point out the details," I continued, leaning in conspiratorially. "Observe the pristine white shirt, the silk bow tie, the absolute perfection of the French cuff closures." I pointed to the tuxedo's sleeve. "Does a dog who intends to intimidate invest this heavily in his dry cleaning budget?" I think not. Mr. Tank is simply misunderstood. He has natural gravitas that Mrs. Henderson mistakenly perceives as aggression. One of the council members, a sweet-looking older lady, leaned forward. "The tuxedo is lovely, Mr. Carter. Is it fire retardant?" "Madam, it is wool and satin. I will check the tags, but I assure you, my client is highly resistant to spontaneous combustion, I replied, keeping a straight face. The room was now visibly stifling laughter. Karen was vibrating with fury, but she couldn't articulate her objection. The image of the menacing dog was impossible to reconcile with the dog that looked like he was waiting for the stock market to open. I played my ace card. I produced a tiny, elegantly folded note card. Finally, Mr. Chairman, my client has prepared a formal statement, I announced. I opened the card and cleared my throat. The room fell silent. Ahem. To the esteemed members of the Community Council, my apologies for any unintentional sense of menace my natural gravitas may have caused. I assure you that I am committed to maintaining a dignified and polite aesthetic. Sincerely, Tank Carter, Senior Project Consultant. And it is signed with his paw print in archival ink. The sight of the tiny note and the absurdity of the formal apology was the final blow. Mr. Peterson buried his face in his hands for a moment, then straightened up. Mrs. Henderson, he said, his voice thick with suppressed emotion. Your complaint hinges on the visual presentation of the dog. Mr. Carter has provided what this council deems adequate mitigation. He banged the gavel again. Complaint 2024-44 is hereby dismissed on the grounds of absurdity and adequate mitigation. Furthermore, Mr. Tank is commended for his commitment to formalware in the public sphere. Victory! Tank wagged his tail once, a slow, dignified sweep. Karen stared at me, her face a mask of thwarted, bureaucratic rage, before storming out, muttering about an appeal to the Supreme Court. I just winked at Tank. We won the battle of optics. With the HOA safely neutralized, the fortress construction entered its final stages. Big Tony and his crew, now somewhat accustomed to working under the sartorial supervision of a canine, just grumbled and built. Tank, of course, was always present, either inspecting the verticality of a newly placed railing or demanding belly rubs, which I interpreted as approval of the structural integrity. The escalation, however, came not from Karen's complaint, but from her sheer desperation. One Tuesday morning, Tank and I were out inspecting a new load of composite decking. Tank, in his white tux, we had upgraded to a second, lighter suit for construction supervision, got a little too excited by the prospect of chewing on a discarded scrap of wood. He tugged his leash, darted into the quiet residential street, and let out a single, triumphant but loud bark. A driver, startled more by the sight of a large, suited dog than the bark itself, slammed on the horn. It was a minor incident, lasting 3 seconds, but 3 seconds was all Karen needed. Less than 5 minutes later, a police car, the epitome of serious, tax-funded authority, rounded the corner. It wasn't an emergency. The officer was driving slowly, but the lights were definitely flashing. Officer Reynolds stepped out. He was young, clean-cut, and wore the expression of a man who just wanted to go home and watch sports, not deal with neighborhood dog drama. He looked like the poster child for bored professionalism. He approached Big Tony first. Sir, I have a report of a disturbance involving public safety, excessive noise, and a potentially dangerous animal. Tony, holding a nail gun, just shrugged his huge shoulders. Noise is within code. Animal is standing right there. He gestured toward Tank. Officer Reynolds' eyes, trained to be neutral, landed on Tank. Tank was standing next to me, tail wagging politely, his white tuxedo gleaming in the morning sun. He looked less dangerous, and more like he was waiting for the yacht club to open. Officer Reynolds' expression didn't change, but I swear his eyebrows did a tiny, almost imperceptible twitch. He walked past Tony, and addressed me. "Sir, I understand there's been a report of a disturbance involving a large quadruped violating traffic laws and creating a loud noise," he said, his voice flat. "That would be Mr. Tank, officer," I said, stepping forward. I tried to look as respectable as possible, which was difficult when discussing my dog in a tux. "Senior project consultant, currently in full-dress white tie, though I admit we opted for a more relaxed morning suit for the site visit." Officer Reynolds stared at the tuxedo. He stared at me. He stared at Tank, who let out a quiet little huff that could easily be interpreted as a dignified clearing of the throat. "I see," the officer said, pulling out his notepad. "And why is your consultant wearing a tuxedo on a Tuesday morning in the street?" This was it. The moment I had to explain the entire ridiculous saga to the straightest man in the county. "Officer, I'm afraid this is the result of a long-standing neighborhood feud concerning optics," I explained, adopting a somber, informative tone. "The neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, filed a formal complaint with the HOA that Tank looked mean. She was concerned with his threatening appearance. So I mitigated the risk by investing in maximum formal attire to convey an air of solemn, non-threatening dignity." I paused. Officer Reynolds wrote something down. I couldn't see what, but I hoped it was "owner is clinically absurd." "The suit, officer, is the counter-argument to the complaint. It makes any attempt to claim menace impossible. If he's a menace, he's a well-dressed menace. It's about fighting absurdity with formality." Officer Reynolds flipped a page in his notepad. He cleared his throat. "And the noise complaint?" "That was a celebratory bark of successful material delivery," I clarified. "He was approving the grade of the decking timber. My apologies for the enthusiasm." The officer looked at the giant, suited dog again. He looked at me, a man clearly in control of his faculties, yet deeply committed to this bit. Finally, he closed his notepad. He took a deep, shuddering breath. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice lower now. "The noise level is compliant. The disturbance was minimal. However, the dog is required to remain off the asphalt, regardless of his sartorial choices. We don't have a section in the municipal code for menacing attire, only for leash laws." He then leaned in slightly and looked directly at Tank. He actually spoke to the dog. "Well," Officer Reynolds said quietly to Tank, "you certainly look prepared for an opening night, but keep the consultant off the asphalt." He got back into his cruiser and drove away. No sirens, no fuss, just a profound sense of having dealt with the weirdest complaint of his career. Big Tony and his crew exploded into silent, shaking laughter. "Prepared for an opening night," Tony wheezed, wiping his eye. "The dog's a goddamn fashion statement, Carter." "Optics, Tony. Optics win every time," I declared, high-fiving Tank's paw. The canine observation deck and fortress was complete. It was magnificent. It was elevated. It had a small, custom-engraved brass plaque that read, "T. Carter, Senior Project, Consultant." It was excessive, unnecessary, and absolutely perfect. To commemorate the occasion and to officially rub Karen's face in the sheer, undeniable triumph of absurdity, I decided to throw a small, ridiculously formal inauguration party. I printed out invitations that read, "You are cordially invited to the inauguration of the Canine Observation Deck and Fortress. Black tie optional, humans. Black tie mandatory, canines." A handful of neighbors, the ones who secretly hated Karen and had been watching the saga unfold like a reality show, showed up. I served champagne, cheap Prosecco in fancy flutes, and artisanal dog biscuits. Tank, the guest of honor, was wearing his finest, a brand-new white tuxedo with a black satin trim and a diamond-studded, rhinestone-studded, bow tie. He was truly majestic, holding court atop his fortress, surveying his kingdom with the serene confidence of a man who knows he has excellent credit. Everything was going perfectly until the inevitable. Karen showed up, uninvited. She stomped onto my lawn, cutting straight through a conversation about mortgage rates and Tank's surprisingly good posture. She was dressed in her classic attack wear, a khaki vest and a face full of self-righteous fury. "Liam, I knew it! I knew this entire absurd construction project was just an attempt to violate the community's aesthetic guidelines," she announced, her voice booming over the soft jazz I had playing. "This deck is clearly beyond the maximum permissible height for accessory structures, and is that a plaque? You cannot dedicate a structure to an animal in this community." She planted her feet, ready for the final, epic lecture, her finger wagging wildly. "I am calling the fire marshal, the zoning commission, and I'm going to personally petition the HOA to have this entire blight." She trailed off. Her eyes narrowed, focusing on something behind me. At that exact moment, a tiny, fluffy gray kitten, no bigger than a teacup, which had clearly wandered away from the elderly couple next door, stumbled directly onto my lawn, right between Karen and me. It looked terrified, paralyzed by the sheer volume of Karen's voice. Before anyone could react, Tank, the majestic, magnificent, tuxedo-wearing menace, slowly descended the new ball retrieval ramp. He didn't bark. He didn't lunge. He simply walked, his white tux making him look like an angel of formal vengeance. He reached the trembling kitten, lowered his huge, imposing head, and instead of doing anything remotely menacing, he gently nudged the kitten with his wet nose, pushing it softly back toward the safety of the neighbor's property line. His tail gave a single, slow, dignified tap-tap against the wood of his fortress. The entire party went silent. Karen's mouth was hanging open, mid-tirade. The small, scared kitten, nudged by a dog who looked like he was about to give it a loan application, finally bolted toward its owner's porch. The silence broke, not with a cheer, but with a sudden, beautiful wave of passive-aggressive neighborhood consensus. "Oh, Janice, honestly," said one of the neighbors, a woman Karen frequently criticized for her lawn gnomes. "He's clearly just performing a community service, a very formal, polite community service." Another chimed in. "Tank just proved he's more of a gentleman than half the men on this street. Frankly, Mrs. Henderson, I think your Yorkie looks suspiciously casual. Maybe he should wear a tiny bow tie before you start judging others' aesthetic choices." Karen was defeated. She was beaten, not by anger, but by the overwhelming, undeniable, pure goodness of a dog whose natural heroism was amplified by the sheer absurdity of his tailored suit. She sputtered, turned red, and then, without another word, she executed a swift, humiliating retreat, stomping off my lawn and back to her house. We had won. The tuxedo had worked. I leaned down and hugged Tank, careful not to wrinkle his suit. "You are the best, most elegant menace this neighborhood has ever known, buddy." Tank responded by trying to lick the champagne flute in my hand. The canine observation deck and fortress stands proudly in my backyard. Tank still wears a tuxedo on our neighborhood walks, now often accessorized with a tiny, ridiculous non-prescription reading glasses for that added touch of intellectual authority. The neighborhood loves it. Kids wave, people take photos, and Big Tony occasionally stops by just to shake Tank's paw and ask the consultant if he has any new projects lined up. Karen? She still lives 2 doors down, but she is utterly defanged. She avoids eye contact, walks her aggressively casual Yorkie on the opposite side of the street, and has never filed another complaint. How can you complain that a dog looks mean when he's dressed like he's about to be seated for a 7-course meal? You can't. Formal wear is the ultimate shield against petty grievances. I look at Tank, asleep on his deck, snoring softly in his perfectly tailored white tuxedo. I realize the suit isn't just spite. It's a permanent, ridiculous shield. It's a hilarious, beautiful monument to fighting the small-minded with the utterly magnificent. We bought the tux to win a battle, but we ended up winning the entire absurd war. I'm already researching a tiny top hat for the Christmas card photos. We have a reputation to maintain, after all. A reputation for formal, ridiculous, and utterly non-menacing elegance.